Lead contamination in St. Louis. We'll have that story next on City Corner. I'm Steve Potter and welcome to City Corner. The lead contamination in the water of Flint, Michigan has been a big story recently, but it's a concern really across the country. And later we're going to talk about it with the director of the Missouri Poison Center. But first, I'd like to introduce you to Blythe Bernhard. She is a reporter who recently wrote a front-page article on the St. Louis Post-Dispatch titled "A Persistent Poison." Blythe, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Should the Flint story alarm us here in St. Louis?
Well, I think the Flint story definitely caught a lot of people's attention, and a lot of people wondered, is this happening here, or could this happen here? And so I checked in with the city, and it turns out that it's unlikely that we could have that same sort of problem in terms of lead pipes. The source of our water is Mississippi and Missouri rivers, and they don't have the corrosive elements that they have in the Flint River. Our water is also treated so as it's not to leach the lead out of the pipes. Mm-hmm. And the water is periodically tested, and it's safe to drink. However, the problem we do have in St. Louis remains lead in the paint.
Right, but that's an old story. That's an old story. Right.
So lead in paint was outlawed in 1978, but 90% of the housing stock in St. Louis City was built before 1978, so a lot of that paint is still out there. And it turns out that we still have about 9% of children in St. Louis City with high levels of lead in their bodies, and that's from the paint in their homes mostly.
And so what does that really mean? As far as I understand, Blythe, if you have a high level of lead, it doesn't really make you at least visibly sick, or you don't have symptoms.
Right, that's sort of one of the big problems. There's no safe level of lead in our bloods. It is not something that we should naturally have in our bodies. And lead can cause a lot of problems with our neurological systems.
Particularly when you're like under 5, isn't that the magic number?
Right, you're still growing, your brain is still developing, and that's when you're more at risk from these problems.
Or if you're a woman who happens to be pregnant.
Right.
But what about, say, an adult like you or I? Is it something that we should be concerned about?
For sure. I mean, nobody, like I said, there's no safe level of lead in the blood. It's just that the developing children are more at risk for having learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, their growth can be stunted. Mm-hmm. These sorts of things are definitely more of a problem for children.
Well, what can you share about the historical problem? You said lead was banned in 1978, I think, and I think maybe it was a couple of decades earlier in that there was another ban, but maybe a lesser ban, if I can put it that way. So how long has it been something we've been concerned about as a society?
Right. So we looked back and found that we've been testing the blood lead levels in children since 50s, the 60s, and in the 70s it reached epidemic levels. I mean, a majority of children had high levels of lead in their blood. There was also lead in gasoline at that time, so right. That was another source.
You just get that through breathing it, I guess?
Right.
With the gas? Yeah.
So by 1990, 1 in 4 children in St. Louis City had high levels of lead in their blood. And the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has continually lowered our threshold for what's considered an at-risk level of lead in the blood. So while we've had fewer children having high levels, very high levels of lead, as they've lowered the threshold, we still have children who are at risk and whose homes deserve attention.
Well, this will be a question we'll ask later to the director of the Missouri Poison Center, but should we as adults ever think about being tested for it? Is that even necessary?
Probably not. I mean, the children are sort of the red flags. They're supposed to be tested every year, starting at age 1 until they're 6 years old. That's in the city and several zip codes in the county, also other areas across the state like Herculaneum, where there's lead occurring from the mining operations. So one of the big problems is we're only testing about 50% of the kids in the city. So there's sort of a disconnect between the pediatricians, the health department, and this public health message that every kid should be tested.
Well, the question then would be why?
Right. I think it's access to care, it's a lack of information. A lot of pediatricians in South City might not think this is a problem, as big of a problem here, even though it can happen anywhere there are old houses, and we know that the old houses are everywhere.
Right, but I guess there would be pockets just because of the age of the construction, wherever it might be, that certain areas of the metro area would be more prone to it than others.
Sure, and where landlords haven't kept up with the homes, and they're not doing the remediation that they need to be doing. But again, yeah, every child is supposed to be tested every year from 1 to 6.
No kidding, wow. Yeah, well, the whole lead situation is something I've heard my entire life growing up. It's something sort of like on the back burner. How long have you been at the Post-Dispatch, and have you written about this before?
Yeah, I've been at the Post-Dispatch for 8 years, and we have written about this before. The city had great success in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. Mayor Slay made this a priority.
Let me just interrupt you. We're looking at some photographs of people, I guess, removing lead. What can you tell us about that?
Right. This is at a home in North City. There is a 4-year-old living in the home, and this child tested with high lead levels high enough, like in the 20s. The threshold for attention is at 5. That's micrograms per deciliter of blood. So these workers come out. This is a free program. It's important for people to know that you're not going to get in trouble if your child tests high for lead. In fact, the city will come out and take care of it. You'll have visits from nurses, home visits. They will come out and keep testing and making sure that those lead levels in the child's blood are going down. So these workers are out there removing the offending paint, old paint, and repainting. Windows are a particular problem because you're opening and closing them, and that's going to disturb the paint and create dust that contains lead. So they're paying particular attention to the windows. And what's really interesting is when we went out to this home, and actually one of these city workers had been lead poisoned as a child. So we are now seeing the second generation of children in St. Louis with lead poisoning.
Is there much risk to people like we just saw in those photographs who are taking care of it? Is there any risk to them at all?
Yeah, you'll see them wearing protective gear because there is a risk.
Well, how complicated of an issue is this really? Do all the experts agree on everything?
Everyone agrees that lead is a problem and we need to get it out. It's a very, very complicated issue because even when you're repainting, I mean, it's impossible to get rid of all of the sources of lead. That old paint is stubborn, and it's very difficult to eliminate it completely.
And it's more of a risk to young kids just because they more easily are able to ingest it, right?
Right, they're on the floor, they're crawling around, their hands are always in their mouth, their toys are in their mouth, so they're breathing in that dust from the floor, and the lead can also be in the soil. They're ingesting it, they're breathing it. They're the ones who are on the front lines.
What are the organizations or the individuals or groups that you interviewed to write your story? Multiple, I'm sure.
Yeah, right. Unfortunately, there's been a loss of grant money for lead abatement programs. So the city has its budget for lead improvement projects has has really been decreased a lot.
Can I interrupt you? Did they cut the funding just for that, or was it just an overall budget cut and it just happened to suffer?
Yeah, this is all part of the federal budget cuts. There used to be a lot of money in HUD grants for fixing up these homes. I mean, even 10 years ago, they might have been fixing 1,000 homes a year. Last year, they only fixed 50 homes in the city. And when we're talking about 3,300 kids in the city with high blood lead levels.
And those are the ones we know about.
Those are the ones we know about. Like we said, only half the kids get tested and 50 homes getting fixed. So there's a real disconnect between.
You talked a little bit about what the effects could have on a young kid. Maybe could you expand on that a little bit? I mean, how serious is it if you've got a 5-year-old kid that is ingesting lead through inhaling it or tasting it or whatever it might be in your home, and that's going on for a couple of years? What could really happen to that kid when they become an adult?
Yeah, well, like I said, you could have stunted growth, so the child might end up not reaching their full height potential. Wow. They could have a few points knocked off their IQ.
Really?
Right. So these are subtle but real effects, permanent effects on the brain. Learning disabilities. It's sort of just setting the child back.
It looks like when I say we've done a good job, because in the newspaper article that you wrote, you had a little graph there, statistics, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it is, but I think you looked over the last 10 years or something, the number of kids affected really has been dramatically decreased and was decreasing every year. So, right. I mean, that's good.
Yeah, it's very good. Like I said, there's been a lot of success, but I've heard that the first 90%, is an accomplishment. The last 10% has been a real challenge, a very stubborn. The rate of improvement has stalled out.
Is that just because they've been so successful, they're not paying enough attention to the last 10%? Is that part of it, or?
I think that it's a combination. There has been some complacency because the program has been so successful. And also the loss of the grant money has just been really, really hurtful.
Well, in the next segment, we're going to talk to the director of the Missouri Poison Center. What are some of the questions you'd like to ask her?
Well, I think she can talk about the sources of lead poisoning that go beyond the dust from the paint. She can talk more about what happens when a child ingests lead. And in more serious cases, children will need to be hospitalized and treated.
Wow. Gives a whole new meaning to that old term, get the lead out, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're talking about today, the lead situation in St. Louis, and we'll be back with more right after this.
Watching online videos like this one.
Brushing for 2 minutes now can save your child from severe tooth pain later. 2 minutes, twice a day. They have the time.
Experience St. Louis.
I'm Steve Potter, and welcome back to City Corner. We're talking about lead contamination in St. Louis today. We've been talking with Blythe Bernhard. She's a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who recently did a front-page story about the situation here. And joining us now is Julie Weber. She's director of the Missouri Poison Center. Hi, Julie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Julie, you do a lot at the Poison Center that's not involved with lead.
Yes.
Can you just give me a brief description of what your organization does?
The Poison Center has nurses and pharmacists that man a 24-hour hotline to answer any type of poisoning question from childhood to adult. Medications are a good number of our exposures to household cleaning products.
So where does the lead contamination problem rank as far as your organization is concerned? And is this like top of the list?
It's not in our top 10 of the list, but it kind of hits the middle there. We get at least 60 calls a year in regards to treatment or information about lead poisoning.
Blythe, you talked to a number of people sort of in Julie's position. How many organizations are there around that deal with this in one way or the other, that you know of anyway?
Right. Well, the public health departments, the city health department is mostly the main organization involved in both testing children and fixing up the homes of children who they find to have high blood lead levels.
The Missouri Poison Center, though, you're affiliated with a local hospital. You're not a state or a city agency in any way, are you?
We're actually a department of Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, but we are the Poison Center accredited for the entire state of Missouri.
Blythe mentioned some other organizations. So do you work with county or city government in any way?
We work real closely with the Department of Health as well on a state level as down to the local levels.
Well, Blythe, I know that you interviewed Julie for your newspaper article. What was the first thing you wanted to know from her?
Well, can you let us know how children are getting lead into their bodies and the primary sources of this?
That's a real good point, because I think, when people talk about, we hear the paint chips, and there's this visual imagery we have of kids eating paint chips. It doesn't seem like like it's really happening.
It really does. And in St. Louis, we do see a lot of our child ingestions are due to the paint chips in the home or even plaster in the walls. In our older homes, plaster has a high lead content. And it's really that young age and their hand-to-mouth motions, especially around that 2-year-old age, that they're getting exposed. But I think we have to even take it beyond the paint chips in the home, that there are a lot of sources that we can also see lead poisoning from. And some of those being even like lead fishing sinkers, things that everyone has in their homes. And
the fishing sinkers.
Yeah, the weights they put on the fishing line, lead curtain weights to hold or weight down the curtains at the bottom. You think about young children crawling around and exploring, and they can ingest these, and if retained for a period of time, that too can increase the lead level. And then there's certain hobbies, and the kind of occupations that us adults have. They can work in with batteries or ammunitions, and they bring that lead dust home on their clothing and can get that throughout the home. And again, we're looking at that it's the young child that's exploring in that dust, and they're not always having their hands washed, and it's going to their mouths.
But it's also a physical thing, too. I mean, their bodies are more susceptible to being damaged than mine would be at my age from lead exposure, right?
Children do have a high risk for lead poisoning, and it's because they're in that developmental age. Fetuses to young children up to the age of 6, we really watch closely, and we're in that development period where really it can lead to attention dysfunction, cognitive changes. As we have mentioned, it can lower the IQ. And so there really can be learning disabilities at this young age that can happen.
And really no symptoms.
Really no symptoms. There's really a continuum of symptoms with lead poisoning, and really at that lower level, there's maybe some mild stomach upset that you don't really relate to this, or irritability or hyperactivity. And so it's really hard to play that out to know if that's lead poisoning.
Blythe, what were some of the questions that you had for Julie in your interview?
So every year there are a handful of kids with acute lead poisoning where their levels are so high that they need to be hospitalized. And can you talk a little bit about how that's treated with an acute problem?
So how we start out with lead poisoning, and I look at that low level, that 5 micrograms per deciliter level, that's an alert level. So we start looking at that, and then when that level creeps up, so we start treatment at about 45 micrograms per deciliter. And when I say treatment, that starts with first getting it out of the home, getting the child away from the source and abatement of the home, and then chelation needs to start. And there's an oral medication that can be given to bind to the lead and help get that removed safely from the body.
So you're not saying that effects from lead poisoning are reversible?
They're not really reversible, but we can stop further effects and remove that lead burden from the body.
Blythe, did you make the point that does the city actually pay for this lead abatement to a person's home? The city takes care of that, the financial end of that?
If there are children in the home or a pregnant woman in the home and they test high for lead levels, then yes, the city has the funds to take care of that. Unfortunately, they're not fixing as many homes as they used to be.
Well, I live in a home that was constructed in the 1880s. How worried should I be?
I think you need to be concerned if you have any chipping paints or plaster that's loose. So what they can do is actually you can encapsulate that, or as long as it's
Does that just mean paint over?
paint over, because I live in an older home as well, and as long as you paint, and the paints these days since 1978 don't have lead in them, you do any plaster repair work and then paint over that, and that seals it in and it doesn't come out. Yet I caution, and we talk a lot about windows, and why we do with the paint around windows is usually it's leaded paint, and that friction from moving the windows up and down or open and closed creates that dust, and then again gets that into the environment where the child can be exposed.
Mm-hmm. So for windows, it wouldn't be as easy as painting over. You'd have to, because if you paint over and the friction would scrape that away, so I guess the windows have to be totally done over. Is that what you're saying?
Sometimes they have to replace the windows, or sometimes I know in our home we had some paint removed from windows and they can heat that. So as we saw in those pictures, the workers are protected and they can burn off that paint and then reprime them and paint over that.
Is part of the problem, Blythe, I don't know if this was part of your article or not, but the cost of having that done to your home, you say the city pays for it in some cases. Is that just, does that have anything to do with the person's financial need? If a person was wealthy in a home, would the city still pay for it?
Right. Again, it's this is a problem that can happen in any neighborhood. 90% of the housing stock has lead paint because it was the homes were built before 1978. So again, yeah, the testing is free every year. The children should be tested from 1 to 6. And that can be done at the city health department. And then if the child tests high enough where the home needs attention, then yes, that should be covered by the city.
But I guess depending on the home, of course, it'd be thousands and thousands of dollars, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
to take
it
care
can.
of it? Yeah.
It can.
What do you recommend kids to be tested? Is there anything else the average person should do?
I think one of the things is we can't just stop at the testing, and that's where I think we fail sometimes. We have to keep getting these children back and trying to make our access to care accessible as we can, because they need to continue to follow back to prevent further poisoning. Mm-hmm. I think as adults in the home, if we know there's that risk, I mean, it's just a good vigilance on keeping the home clean and preventing that dust, and really just being aware of what could be in the home that's a problem.
I think there are a number of different organizations that address this issue in the city one way or another, aren't there? Or at least have been.
There are fewer now than have been in the past, but again, the city health department would be your starting point. They will also have the water tested in your home. Sometimes there are lead pipes in the home, or some of the fixtures have lead in them. And if the home has been sitting empty for a while, the water's been sitting there, there's a chance that there's some lead getting into the water. So the city will collect it and send it to the state for free testing.
I'm glad you mentioned the water again. Julie, we were talking earlier about the water situation in Flint. We don't worry about lead in that way here, do we, or should we?
I think we have a good water source here. If you do live in an older home, I know we recommend sometimes just to run cold water for 30 seconds before filling up your glass to drink it, because that helps get that out of there. There's a higher risk for lead to leach into hot water, so to let it run a little bit. I think what Flint did for us was brought back the awareness that we have a problem with our housing And our risk here in St. Louis
Well,
are
and
with
that's sort
our
of what
paint.
prompted the newspaper's interest in doing another story about it. What was happening in Flint, right, Blythe?
Absolutely. You know, Flint, again, they had an acute problem with their water systems. We have a chronic problem with the lead paint in our homes.
In the article you wrote, Blythe, you quoted Andrew White, who is a professor at Washington University, and he said the Flint situation has overshadowed the larger problem in other cities. What do you think he meant by that exactly?
Well, Flint is getting a lot of attention, as they should. It's a definite problem. But I think the lead paint situation that's happening in all of our older cities has been neglected in the last few years. And so the good news is everyone's sort of taking another look.
And how do you see it from where you sit, from your office?
I think that's what's been so beneficial is it's really brought back to light the risks that we have here in our own city. And we really do want to work to get that abatement done that's going to help with this.
So the Flint thing's been going on for months now. Julie's article was back, I guess, the very last week of January, something like that. Have you noticed more calls coming in because it's been in the news more lately?
I think we're receiving more questions about it and what people can do, and we can help guide them to having their child tested.
We have
to
an
the
800
city.
number that's going to come up, and people, whether they're in Illinois or in the 314 area code or anywhere else, can use this 800 number. How does it work, and how will it help them?
So it's a nationwide toll-free number, and whatever state or area code from you're calling, it directs you to your poison center, and then you get a trained specialist to be able to talk to you. These are nurses and pharmacists that can help answer your questions, help your physician guide further therapy if necessary, and just really reassure. What's nice with our hotline is if you call, we usually call back if it's a situation that we know we need more information or just to reassure and make sure your situation's okay.
Is there any reason to feel good? Not about lead, of course, but good about where we are in addressing all this, even though it is a persistent problem.
Again, I think this attention can only be good. So I think that everyone's sort of trying to get this fixed for good.
Well, we want to thank you. I guess our final word is get the lead out, right?
Yes,
Maybe that should be a bumper sticker or something like that. I want to thank Blythe Bernhard. She is a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and Julie Weber, director of the Missouri Poison Center. Thank you all for throwing some light on this very timely and important topic. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And take advantage of that 800 number, 222-1222. If you have any questions or concerns, give them a call. I'm Steve Potter. That's it for this edition of City Corner. Join us next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.